Dr. Bach, can I say that the dominating political feature of the Georgian period or the 18th century is the rise of a party government?
Well, it's certainly true that there were political parties in England from the 1670s onwards, but we shouldn't think of them as monolithic political parties like they are today. We should remember also that in 1714, with the accession of George I, the Tory party is out of government, and many of the leaders are associated with Jacobitism. Bolingbroke actually goes into exile. And from 1714 for the next half century, there is absolute domination of the Whig party. And politics at the highest level is very fluid. People get into and out of government, and dependent upon their being in favor with a king or their positions on particular policy matters, things are not so monolithic as they have become by the 21st century. Indeed, in the 19th century, that's also true. It's quite possible to have people of different political persuasions in one ministry. So by the end of the 18th century, there's a kind of new division between Tory and Whig, which is growing up. The Tories tend to be country gentlemen who are conservative by temperament, strong supporters of the rights of the Church of England, opponents of the kind of reform that eventually came to pass in 1832, while the Whigs draw on support from the new industrial towns and the traditional liberal aristocracy and those who want to give more opportunity to dissenters, for example, dissenters from the National Anglican Church. So by the end of the period, by the early 19th century, there's a new Tory-Whig division which has grown up, but things are still very fluid.
Wow. I like your comments about the new division of the two parties, and I like the word fluid. It's a very interesting and fresh word and perspective on this issue. Thank you. And speaking of literature, can I say that in the Georgian period or in the 18th century, literature is entangled with politics more than any other periods in the English history?
Well, there are examples of literature and politics being closely entangled, particularly Jonathan Swift, for example, is a very good example of that. But I think I would paint a broader picture here. I would say that what's significant about this period is the intensity of debate and criticism which is happening. In 1695, the Licensing Act removed censorship in the British press and opened the gates to the kind of coffee house discussion of politics and literature. They both go together in the coffee house that we find in the 18th century. There's a vast increase in the number of newspapers, both London newspapers and provincial newspapers. There's much more political argument than you get in European countries. Much more political debate. And we also get the growth of satire. And this, by the end of the century, is demonstrated in the growth of the political cartoon. I mean, I often think the predecessor of the political cartoon is William Hogarth. There are the wonderful series of pictures that he paints, Marriage à la mode, criticizing modern marriage for money, or the Rake's Progress, a young man who spends himself into debauchery and debt and eventually ends up in a lunatic asylum. These are moral messages very critical of modern times and the conduct of the wealthy very often. And at the end of the century, the political cartoons of Gilray in particular, but also of George Cruikshank and Rowlandson and others, but Gilray in particular, these political cartoons in many ways, when we look at them today, we might say they're gross. They're very, very sharp and very critical of not only the aristocracy but of the monarchy itself. I mean, George IV, as Prince Regent, is portrayed in these cartoons as a grossly obese character. And what's interesting about it is that he didn't react by trying to get them censored. He actually bought some of these cartoons of himself and for his own possession. And
that's so very generous.
So satire and caricature and debate are characteristic of the 18th century, and that includes political debate. Which isn't to say there weren't some matters over which there was considerable intolerance, but particularly when it came to fear of Catholicism. But I think Britain was more advanced in Western culture in this respect than other European countries.
It is the most advanced country at that period.
I believe so, and I believe the French thought that. I think I mentioned before that Voltaire wrote his Lettres Anglaises, his English letters, admiring England and wishing that France would move in that direction.
That's very interesting.
It's not often that the French are openly admiring of the British like that.
Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Buck.